1798, Napoleon leads his army into Egypt, establishing a real foothold in Ottoman territory. It seems like a smart move at the time, but we all know he eventually ended up in exile on a tiny rock in the Atlantic. But what if Napoleon had done in the Middle East what he almost did in Egypt, a full-blown invasion of the declining Ottoman Empire? What if Napoleon actually took the Ottomans east? Welcome to AI Time Traveler. Before we start our alternate history, let's talk about our sponsor, Masterworks. Now back to the video. We're going to be answering a lot of questions in this video, but none so important as why would Napoleon invade the Ottoman Empire? And the answer isn't complex. The Ottoman Empire was weak and ripe for the taking. Furthermore, the French emperor had both reasons and opportunities to smash the sick man of Europe further. For one, attacking the Ottomans would allow Napoleon to strike at British trade routes to India. Remember, British India wasn't fully realized in this timeline. But that didn't stop the British East India Company from dominating regional trade and growing their private army to 260,000 troops strong. By invading Ottoman-held Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Syria, Napoleon could undermine British trade with India, putting a dent in the British economy just as crippling as the blockade of mainland Europe. Secondly, Napoleon might want to keep pushing past the Balkans and seize the entirety of the Middle East. Doing so would make him master of the Mediterranean, which would be a boon for any ambitious European power. Finally, it might simply be another way for Napoleon to spread the ideas of the French Revolution across more of the Eurasian landmass. But how exactly would such an invasion play out? Well, since Napoleon already had a base of operations in Egypt, that seems like the most logical place to begin an invasion. His army would first march north along the Levant coast, either taking Damascus or allowing his ally, the Mamluk Sultanate of Cairo, to do so. Then Napoleon could push into Palestine and cross into Anatolia. A force this size would absolutely steamroll through the local Ottoman garrison and Turkish irregulars. After all, the French army during the Napoleonic Wars peaked at around 600,000 men, while the Ottoman army was around 300,000, though rarely all deployed at once. This army was also far more modern and disciplined than their Ottoman counterparts, meaning a straight-up battle would be laughably one-sided. But Napoleon wouldn't have it so easy, not if he wanted to conquer all of Anatolia. That is because, as he swept through Palestine, resistance would almost certainly flare up amongst the many Arab, Kurdish, and Balkan factions within the declining empire. Some groups might throw their support behind Napoleon, hoping for generous autonomy under the new regime. Others would resist, leading to brutal guerrilla campaigns throughout the region. As Napoleon pushed deeper into Anatolia, local lords would raise their own armies to resist the French, and any who sided with Napoleon would face swift retribution. Meanwhile, the war in the East would undoubtedly be more costly than expected. Add to that the threat posed by the massive Russian Empire, and things were quickly starting to look quite difficult for Napoleon. However, there was always the option to sail from Egypt directly to the Levant without marching through Palestine at all. In fact, with sufficient naval power, Napoleon could just skip the land war entirely and blockade the Ottoman navy in the Black Sea while invading Constantinople itself. From there, the rest of Anatolia would fall in short order. But how would the Ottomans react? The simple answer is not well. Internal strife between reformist and conservative factions would likely only end when one side or the other was utterly victorious. Yet despite being on the decline, the Ottoman Empire was still a major player. The sheer manpower available to them, combined with local support, could turn Napoleon's invasion into a costly quagmire. On top of that, any war against the Ottomans would surely provoke the Russians, who might intervene in the Balkans. So Napoleon would need to tread carefully if he wanted to succeed. That said, the Ottomans were in no shape to defend their territories, much less launch a counterattack. Their army was crumbling apart. Their treasury was empty, and their European allies, unimpressed by their decades-long mismanagement of their territories. Still, Napoleon's ego may have gotten the better of him, blinding him to the potential cost of overextending his forces. At this point, he would need to choose between marching on Constantinople or securing his gains in the Levant and facing the Russians in the Balkans. Either choice was risky, but the reward was immense. Not only would conquering the Middle East secure France's status as a global power, but it could bring untold riches to France. Unfortunately, there is little indication that Napoleon actually considered such an invasion feasible, at least not in his own lifetime. Though it is possible he trusted his allies in Egypt to keep the peace while he sorted out his problems in Europe, it's unlikely he would have been comfortable ceding so much territory to a foreign power. If Napoleon did invade the Ottoman Empire, however, the results would be felt around the world. First off, there would be new borders. Gone would be the multi-ethnic state that was the Ottoman Empire, replaced by numerous independent states. Arab states would take control of the Levant and Mesopotamia. Perhaps Greece would declare independence or become a French vassal. And the Kurds might unite their mountain home under a single banner. Even the Arabs would change drastically. No longer having to fear Ottoman interference, the Arabs could finally focus on driving the remaining crusaders out of the region. After all, local rulers would benefit from closer ties to revolutionary France, which was more open to secularism and religious freedom. And if Napoleon stayed true to his word, he would respect the religion and culture of those he conquered. As for the Ottomans, this would likely lead to a far quicker collapse of the empire, and perhaps even lead to a Turkish or a more accurate Kurdistan rising earlier than OTL to fill the power vacuum left by the Turks. However, the very opposite could occur. The pressure of a powerful foreign invader could unify disloyal subjects and lead to a period of Ottoman reform and revitalization. But the effects of such an invasion wouldn't end there. You see, any move on the part of France to dominate the Middle East would enrage the British, leading them to seek revenge. Surely the British would not stand idly by as the French seized Ottoman territory. They might attempt to preemptively strike French interests in Egypt and the Levant. Russia, too, would likely intervene to protect their Orthodox brethren in Constantinople. As such, Napoleon would soon find himself fighting not just the Ottomans, but the British and Russians as well. This could lead to a complete disaster for Napoleon, leading to his defeat and possibly execution. Or it could energize the French to fight harder and achieve victory, potentially ending the war sooner and leading to a larger French empire. Either way, it would ensure that the Middle East would remain a theater of war for some time to come. But perhaps the greatest effect of such an invasion would be felt at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Let's say Napoleon won. He would then have to deal with ruling over a non-European territory. There are several possible solutions here. Maybe Napoleon leaves the administration of the Middle East to local rulers. In this scenario, he would enjoy the benefits of being master of the Mediterranean without the headaches of actually administering distant lands. Or maybe Napoleon attempts to remake the Middle East in the image of France. This would likely fail, given the vast cultural differences between France and the Middle East, not to mention the hostility of the local population towards French rule. Or perhaps Napoleon would install family members and loyalists to run the region, similar to the Spanish Habsburgs. This solution would ensure that the Middle East would remain tied to France, but it would likely lead to massive resentment among the local population. Regardless of how Napoleon chose to rule the Middle East, it would certainly be a challenge. So what does the alternate timeline look like where Napoleon conquers the Ottoman Empire? Well, for starters, there would be many fewer European wars. With the bulk of the French army stationed in the Middle East, there simply wouldn't be enough troops to spare to conquer the rest of Europe. Napoleon would have to rely on a series of puppet states to maintain his influence over the continent. But these puppets would be unlikely to survive for long after Napoleon's demise. Speaking of Napoleon's demise, it's likely that his army in the Middle East would be more vulnerable to attack, meaning his exile could come much sooner than in our own timeline. This would lead to a scramble for control of the Middle East as the European powers sought to capitalize on French weakness. The British, Russians, and Austrians would likely carve up the former French Empire and impose their own rule over the region. The British would likely take Egypt, the Russians would take Constantinople and the rest of Anatolia, while the Austrians would take control of the Balkans. But the Ottomans weren't the only ones to suffer. The rest of Europe would also be changed drastically. Without Napoleon to oppose them, the Russians would likely sweep through the Balkans and seize Constantinople. This would make them masters of the Black Sea and would give them a warm water port. The Germans would likely grow in power as the various German states unified against the weakened French. In fact, it's possible that the Germans would unify earlier than in our own timeline, and that they would become the dominant power in Europe. And that's just the beginning. A Napoleon who controls the Middle East is a Napoleon who never invades Russia. And a Napoleon who never invades Russia is a Napoleon who does not die young and is able to serve multiple terms as emperor. A Napoleon who serves multiple terms would likely establish a Napoleonic dynasty in France, and perhaps even install family members on the throne of the Ottoman Empire. It's also possible that the French Revolution doesn't happen. Without Napoleon's victories, the French people may not rise up and overthrow the monarchy. Instead, the French Revolution may fizzle out into a series of minor reforms. This would lead to a much different Europe, one in which the French Revolution never succeeded and the French remained a minor power on the continent. In fact, this entire alternate timeline could be set in motion simply by giving Napoleon a foothold in the Ottoman Empire, whether that happens through a full-blown invasion or simply by making concessions to the Ottomans in exchange for stable borders in the south. So what do you think? How would Napoleon fare if he invaded the Ottoman Empire? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you liked the video and check out my podcast.